Hey, what's happening guys? How are you all doing? This is Rob of Ro2R Review and welcome back. So what I wanted to do today was spend a little bit of time talking about one of my most anticipated games we know to expect in the coming months, and I'm really kind of upset with myself, honestly, for not having talked about it really between E3 and now. That is crazy, the game is going to be amazing, and that is the Resident Evil 2 Remake. So the main thing I wanted to discuss as far as the Resident Evil 2 Remake is really whether or not the way that they're approaching this remake is the correct or the best way to go about it. I've said this many times, I'm a huge fan of Resident Evil. It is one of, and even possibly my #1 favorite non-Nintendo franchise that exists. It really is a special franchise for me, and I go all the way back to the original PlayStation 1 release in the mid-90s. That is how old I am, and that is how far back I go with Resident Evil. It was actually my good friend Ryan when I was in, I think I would have been a freshman in high school, and he got a PlayStation 1 that first year that it was out. I was living on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and he got a PlayStation. It was really exciting. We were playing Mortal Kombat 3 and all these other cool things, the original Rayman, and just being blown away by the graphics and sound. And then eventually this Resident Evil game came out, and it was such a huge deal. So much conversation, so many great reviews, a lot going on because it was very revolutionary. Even though I know it's not technically the first survival horror game, it definitely was the first breakout survival horror game. It really made a name for itself, and it made a name for the genre, and that really counts for something. And playing that game was like cathartic. It really blew my mind. It was perfect for us as like teenagers, 14, 15-year-old boys playing this cool, mature horror game that's got like blood and monsters and killing and zombies and all of this crazy stuff. I even have a vivid memory of playing the game in his bedroom the very first time we experienced the dogs jumping through that window and scaring the crap out of you in that big hallway in the mansion. Really, it's good stuff, man, and I've been a huge fan of this series all the way up until today. Now, we've known that Capcom was supposedly working on a remake of Resident Evil 2 for quite a while. It was actually years ago, I believe, that they said, hey, this is finally happening. People have been theorizing and asking for something like this for so long, and it's going to happen, so just basically stay tuned. And then they went silent on the thing for so long, and then at E3, just a couple of months ago, finally on Sony's stage, on their press conference, they revealed the first official trailer, and there was a ton of gameplay from E3 for this remake of Resident Evil 2, and it's just been mind-blowing. Don't get me wrong, wherever I go with this idea of how they're attacking it, like, at the end of the day, it looks incredible. I cannot wait. I even made my own list of the top 10 games of E3, and it was my #1 game, so I cannot wait to play it. Now, here's the thing. When it was revealed, and we actually started to see gameplay, I think a lot of us were maybe a little bit surprised on the approach that they were taking. Because I'm not gonna lie, and I think many people were maybe expecting them to do something like what they did with the remake of the original game, and then eventually of Resident Evil 0 a few years ago, where they took the initial game with the static camera angles and the now famous tank controls, and they basically polished up like crazy the visuals for the game. And in the case of the original game on the GameCube in 2002, they added a ton of content, and it was really incredible. One of my 10 favorite games of all time, the original Resident Evil remake, specifically on the GameCube. And, hey, the original Resident Evil 2 that released also on the PlayStation and a variety of platforms did the same thing. That's how the first several Resident Evil games were. And so knowing that they remade the original Resident Evil, and then they also remade Resident Evil 0, and then knowing Resident Evil 2 was getting its own remake, I kind of jumped to the conclusion that they were going to do something similar, only in a more modern 2018, 2019 kind of style and graphics. And I was over the moon excited for that, guys, because Resident Evil 2... it's probably my favorite of the original unremastered Resident Evil games. I think the remake of the original game is better than Resident Evil 2, but I think Resident Evil 2 is better than the original release of Resident Evil 1. That was probably really confusing, but I'm sure you guys could follow along. So I love the original Resident Evil 2, and I was like, oh my god, they're going to remake it just like they did the first one, and it's going to be so great. It's going to be one of the greatest games ever. I can't wait. But then we saw it at E3, and in fact, it turned out to look like Resident Evil 4. And so this kind of brings me back to the original topic and purpose of this video, because I have, quite a few feelings on this decision. Thinking it was going to look like the original version of Resident Evil 2 and seeing they've actually made it look more like Resident Evil 4. And so what's the best approach? Was this the right decision for them to do is essentially what this comes down to. Now, what I have to tell you guys is, again, like I was saying, I love Resident Evil 2. I really love the remake of Resident Evil 1. It's a top 10 game for me. I also really love Resident Evil 4. In fact, it's my favorite Resident Evil, and it's probably a top 3 or 4 game for me, personally, all time. I mean, it really is one of the absolute best gaming experiences I've ever played, and very few games since then have topped it. In fact, I don't even know, maybe The Last of Us, The Wind Waker was before that even, Metroid Prime clearly, so it's tough for me to say, but it's really high on my list. And so seeing the Resident Evil 2 remake, I'm of two minds here. It's like, well, I love that they're making it look like Resident Evil 4 because that's my favorite Resident Evil. I think it's the best one they ever made. But also, I really love that remake. I was expecting this to be like that remake. And I know that people nowadays might laugh at me for this. But I love the tank controls. Not because they're like good, because they're not technically good controls, but I do have a nostalgic connection to them. And what's great is when they took the Resident Evil remake and brought it into the modern age in 2014 or 15, I think, on the PS4, they actually they left in both the original tank controls, and they also included new modern controls that didn't really operate that way, and that was great. So my hope was that they were going to do the same thing and just include both controls. So I was like, oh man, I'll get to play Resident Evil 2 with new graphics and new content. I can use the tank controls, and people who hate those can use the newer controls, and it's going to be great. And so now I'm conflicted because, like, I wanted the original way I thought they were going to do it, but now they're making it like Resident Evil 4. And so anyway, I'm making this long in the tooth. The point is, are they making the best decision? And I honestly have two answers. I don't care if people think that's a cop-out, but I do have two true answers. And so here's the thing. For myself, I feel like they're not making the best choice. I was really hoping they were going to bring back the static camera angle classic tank control Resident Evil in 2018, 2019. I thought that would have been great. And what a great way to show love and support for like the history and lineage of Resident Evil and try to bring these controls and this kind of gameplay into the modern age and maybe give us hope that Resident Evil 8 would do the same thing and go back to its roots. I wanted to play a new Resident Evil that's rooted in the roots of the gameplay and the style of gameplay. But I think for the larger audience of gaming today, and I think for the success of the game, that yes, they are making the right choice by making it look and play and feel like Resident Evil 4. I mean, let's be honest, guys, when you look at that game and you consider how Resident Evil 4 plays compared to the older games, it's a more modern style of play. It's a little bit more action heavy. It's a little bit, you have quite a bit more control over your character and the gameplay experience compared to those tank control games. And I think that it's something that they knew people would gravitate towards. It would get people really excited. And it's also like really flashy and showy. It shows off the amazing graphics that the game has. You can create a pretty incredible atmosphere and ambience with that. And so it's like I can't really fault them. Not to mention, if we're being honest, the amount of effort and time and love that would have to go into this game to recreate it this way as opposed to just putting a new sheen over the original game, it's pretty extensive. So they've obviously put a crap ton of work into this game, and that always has to be commended when you know somebody works that hard on a game. And it's not necessarily like remaking the original static camera angle version of Resident Evil 2 would have been an easy task, or that they would have been lazy if they took that route. I think it just shows that they instead went several extra steps, several extra miles more than they probably needed to make this game the way it is. I mean, they essentially, similar to games like Samus Returns, for example, they basically have created a brand new game. That is one of the most exciting elements about this, is that it's going to be like, yes, playing obviously some of the same story and character beats and stuff from the original version of Resident Evil 2, but we're also going to be playing like an entirely new game. And a lot of the gameplay that we've seen has essentially shown that. So I just think it's going to be so impressive, so cinematic, so fun, and like, hey, I am excited to play another Resident Evil that plays like Resident Evil 4. I am also somebody who doesn't hate Resident Evil 5 or 6. They are significantly less good compared to every other Resident Evil game ever made, but they're not total disasters like some people want to make them out to be. However, they did go a little bit too action-heavy, and so I feel like what they're doing with Resident Evil 2 is taking the best parts of the old-school Resident Evil 2 and the best parts of the Resident Evil 4 gameplay and atmosphere, and making just an incredible, huge, zombie-filled Resident Evil adventure. We're getting Leon back, we're getting those Lickers back, we're getting Ada Wong back. It's just going to be the most incredible experience. And so, Yes, I do sort of lament the fact that we're not getting a new 2019 tank control Resident Evil game. I really, the old school nostalgic fan in me was so excited for that, you guys. I was ready to dive in. I was like, yes, go back to the roots. This is what we want. It's not just being scary, it's also the way the games were laid out. But this really is the best move going forward. Yes, it makes me sad, but for the game, it's going to mean the most success. Especially, I'm sure a lot of younger gamers and people who, like, don't really know or understand the roots of Resident Evil probably think, oh yeah, this is that cool new flashy Resident Evil. It's got great graphics and guns and explosions, and it's going to be super cool. You're shooting things like Call of Duty. It's going to be great. And so they'll pick it up and get something really special. For people like me, it's like, yeah, we maybe think of the older style as opposed to this newer style, but I don't think that anyone who feels the way I do is going to overall be disappointed with this. I mean, I feel like it's impossible not to be excited with what they're doing with this game. And so that's really all I wanted to say and kind of discuss when it comes to this game. I've been meaning to talk about it for a while. I don't make enough non-Nintendo videos anymore, and this really is a game that essentially is at the top of my upcoming games list. I mean, Metroid Prime 4 is a mystery as far as release date and even what the game looks like and plays like and all that stuff, so even though that would be a clear-cut #1, since that game's a mystery, as far as games we know about, like, Resident Evil is #1, man. I can't wait to see what they're doing here. And it'll be interesting to see if they ever do decide to go back to some of the older Resident Evil style. I would love it if they did something, even like I'm going to hate myself for saying this because I hate downloading games, but if they made like a $30 downloadable, like, spin-off Resident Evil experience, you know, something like they tried to do with Revelations 2, but they made it a more complete game, and it was a new experience that played like the older games, that would be so freaking cool to me, man. I would love it if they did something like that, so that's probably just wishful thinking. At this point, hey, I'm not gonna look a gift horse in the mouth. I am happy with the Resident Evil 2 that they're giving us. I think it's gonna be amazing, and I just can't wait to play it when it comes out in January next year. So, what do you guys think? Are you pumped about the game? Are you less than enthused about it? How do you feel about my discussion here about whether or not they should have made it like the original Resident Evil 2, or if it was a smart move for them to make it like Resident Evil 4, or however you feel? I want to hear you talk about it. I don't get to talk enough Resident Evil on the channel, man. It's really kind of a shame. So this was a lot of fun to do. Tell me what you guys think. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in. This is Rob of Rule of 2 Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.